Good evening, everyone. I'm Keegan Chetwynd, the director of the Military Aviation Museum, and we just want to thank you all for joining us for another one of our ongoing series of webinars. Tonight's topic is General Douglas MacArthur. We've actually got Jim Zoble with us from the MacArthur Memorial over in Norfolk. He's going to talk to us about a complex man and his complex relationship with air power. Jim is the archivist over at the MacArthur Memorial, and he's been their archivist and historian for the past 27 years. He's also the author of the book, The Supreme Commander at War. And I think what we're going to get tonight is a window into some of the research and incredible storytelling that they do over there at the memorial, keeping the legacy of General MacArthur alive. And in a curious twist of fate, he lives off Princess Anne Road. He's pretty much our neighbor out here, so he's not altogether too far from the museum right at the moment. So Jim, if you can hear us and you're ready to go, I'll turn it over to you.
Sounds great, and thanks a lot. Thanks for having me and the MacArthur Memorial in your home tonight. That's it right there. If you've never been down to Norfolk, that's what it looks like. It's right in the center of downtown Norfolk. That's where they measure all the distances from. And tonight's topic, like was said, is about Douglas MacArthur and air power. You know, some of the most iconic images that you see of MacArthur are him with airplanes. The guy had a 52-year career, and basically the airplane is part of the whole time. He graduates in 1903, and of course that's the same year that the Wright brothers do their experiments down at Kitty Hawk. He graduates that summer. They have their experiments that December. And so it's always a part of, you know, his whole career. And the thing is, though, he sees the progression of air power that goes from the Wright Flyer all the way to the jet age. And he really, if you want to know the story about MacArthur and air power, it's really MacArthur and his air commanders, because MacArthur's the kind of guy who gives a person a job and expects them to do it. He wants them to do it, you know, with little monitoring and be loyal and not fail, basically. And you know that because in World War II, at one point, a journalist asked him, you know, what's the Air Force doing right now? And MacArthur said, I don't know, go ask George Kenney, you know, because Kenney is his air commander at that time. And MacArthur had complete faith in what he was doing, so to speak. MacArthur, as we all know, learned some very hard lessons about air power in that opening day, December 8th, in the Philippines. But he learned it quickly, and the Japanese made him pay a price to learn that lesson that you can't do anything in the modern era without air power. And after that time in 1942, even though he probably didn't understand the capabilities of air power before that moment, he became one of its most avid opponents or proponents of air power for the rest of his life on the way in through Korea. And basically, you can understand how a lot of that happened because of his total belief in air power at that point. Now, MacArthur knows about air power and the dangers early on. Like I said, he graduates in 1903, and one of his classmates is Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge. And as we all know, Selfridge is he is the first military aviator that gets killed in a plane crash. The Army was going to buy some of these Wright Flyers, and Selfridge went up with Orville Wright to check it out, and one of the propellers went bad, and it caused the struts and the guide wires to fail. And Wright was able to guide the plane in to about 75 feet, but then it totally crashed, and Selfridge died in this crash. So it's something that reverberates through the class. Everybody knows about it. Everybody knew Selfridge, and MacArthur, of course, knows as well. His first experience, of course, comes from World War I on the battlefield. He's the chief of staff and then one of the brigade commanders of the Rainbow Division in World War I. This is a National Guard division that brings in troops from Ohio and New York and as well as Iowa and Alabama. And it's stationed up there in its training point in outside Garden City at Hempstead Plains. And that's right where the Curtiss aircraft plant is at that point. And so all these Alabama kids and everybody else who's lived out in the sticks, they're seeing airplanes for the first time. Now, MacArthur is going to know a lot of these people that will be a big part of the Air Corps in that World War I experience. Eddie Rickenbacker here on the left, MacArthur knows him, meets him in France. They'll be friends for the rest of their lives. Quentin Roosevelt there in the center. Roosevelt, he knew because MacArthur was aide to Teddy Roosevelt back in 1908. Of course, on the right is Billy Mitchell, who run the air service during the First World War, and MacArthur's basically known him his whole life. He does get the experience of what happens with air power during the war at the Battle of Champagne. The Rainbow Division was right east of Rheims during Ludendorff's last offensive. They fought and broke the back of the Germans then, but when they were pulling out to go to the Chateau Thierry region, those German Gotha bombers were just wreaking havoc, and MacArthur got the first experience of how it can be brought to the home front, because the bombers were just plastering Chalon-sur-Marne, and they noticed that all the townspeople were sleeping out in the fields because the city was getting bombed so hard. At the Ourcq River as well, German air power controlled the area, and MacArthur, like all infantry officers, he basically sees the air power as an adjunct to what goes on the ground. But the Germans had complete air supremacy at this point, and it was basically a nuisance factor more than anything. It's at this place in the Meuse Argonne, the Côte des Chatillons, in World War I. This is the linchpin of the Hindenburg line, the Kriemhilde-Stellung, and it was what you'd expect, ringed with barbed wire and machine guns, everything else. And MacArthur's brigade was given the task to take this. At first, they ordered a night bayonet attack, which was just madness. That was called off. The whole staff got together, and they were trying to search for a way to get through. And at that point, reconnaissance photos were brought in, and you could see exactly where all the wiring was. They were able to put together a attack that broke through and really broke the Hindenburg line. 2 weeks later, the war was over. The British had broken through, the French, and now the Americans, because of MacArthur's, what he sees from photo intelligence that comes from airplanes. So MacArthur has a pretty good understanding of what air power can do. Billy Mitchell, of course, comes home after the war. He's the main proponent of an independent Air Force. He believes this is the wave of the future. You have to invest everything into air power, and will make a lot of people very angry. A lot of the brass just don't like his brashness, basically. Charles Menaher, who is head of the Air Service, is very upset because his job is to keep the air service as part of an adjunct of the infantry itself, whereas Mitchell is trying to push together this independent Air Force. Now, the big thing is in 1921, because the Navy had kind of fudged some reports, the Congress wants an investigation, and so they put together these bombing tests. And Billy Mitchell and his flyers will take off right from Langley. They hold them about 50 miles off the Chesapeake Bay. And the thing is, Douglas MacArthur isn't there, but his brother, Captain Arthur MacArthur, he commands the USS Henderson that takes all the VIPs out to the test. During the test, Mitchell's guys, they bomb the Ostfriesland, the old German battleship, and send it to the bottom. They know they can hit right to the side of it and just convulse the plates of the battleship. Pretty much everything submerged. A couple of years go past, and Billy Mitchell is just very upset because the Navy is still investing into battleships rather than into air power, and he'll just start calling the brass basically a bunch of idiots. Like I said, he got Menaher very upset, as well as Pershing early on. And Menaher, during World War I, had been MacArthur's division commander for the Rainbow Division. So in 1925, when they tried Mitchell for insubordination, they put MacArthur on the Board of Inquiry. Now, they all vote to convict him except MacArthur. And the thing is the MacArthurs and the Mitchells had been lifelong family friends. Arthur MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur's father, he served with John Mitchell, Billy Mitchell's father, in the 24th Wisconsin. Billy Mitchell served under Arthur MacArthur in the Philippines. He was on his staff. Arthur MacArthur's father, Douglas MacArthur's grandfather, Arthur MacArthur, another one, was best friends with Alexander Mitchell, the old scion of Milwaukee. As well, Douglas MacArthur dated both of Billy Mitchell's sisters, and so he votes for acquittal. And they found the votes later on, and they knew that MacArthur hadn't voted to. MacArthur didn't believe that a person should be hounded just because they disagree with what a junior officer has to say. Now, the interesting thing is Douglas MacArthur's second wife was Jean MacArthur. She's the one that's buried to him in the memorial. And she said that during March of 1943, during World War II, when the Bismarck Sea Convoy got hammered by air power, she was living with Douglas MacArthur. And she said, as all these reports were coming in, MacArthur was just walking up and down the apartment, and he would just stop and raise his hands and be like, Billy Mitchell, Billy Mitchell, you know, because everything Mitchell had said had basically come true about air power. Now, in the 1930s, Douglas MacArthur becomes the chief of staff of the United States Army, and it's the Depression, and he is focused on nothing but keeping the officer corps whole. As well, he needs to keep the Army strength at 150,000. That comes from the National Defense Act in 1920. Now, they put money into research and development in the Air Department as well as in mechanization of the tanks, but it's all research. They don't build anything because MacArthur knows if you build all this stuff, it's just going to be obsolete in a couple of years anyway. All the stuff they had built since World War I ended was already obsolete by the time of 1930. But you've got a lot of politicians like this Ross Collins from Mississippi that are always trying to get an independent air service. And the thing is, they had been turned into the Air Corps in 1926. They had been on a 5-year plan that ends right when MacArthur comes into office. And Benjamin Foulois, who runs the Air Corps, he's trying to get an independent service as well. But they're still keeping it an adjunct of the infantry. The thing is that MacArthur had this gentleman's agreement with Admiral Fletcher Pratt, who runs he's the chief of naval operations. And they have this gentleman's agreement over air reconnaissance off the coast of America. And Pratt agrees that American Army air power can do reconnaissance outside the range of coastal artillery. Now, this gives the Air Corps their bread and butter. This becomes their doctrine, strategic long-range bombing of targets, and they will hold on to this power that they've been given by this gentleman's agreement, even after it ends when MacArthur leaves, and it really gives the Air Corps their doctrine. Now, in 1933, the Airmail Service of the United States Postal Office couldn't handle it, and Roosevelt asked the Air Corps to take over, and they botched it horribly. But it was probably the best thing that could have happened, because at that time they reorganized and they did the administration over again, and they got everything on a stable ground. Now, MacArthur did squash most of the air power initiatives, and he had to because it was the Depression, but he apologized to Kenney during World War II. He said, I did a lot of this stuff that I shouldn't have done. But the thing is that at the end of its time, under MacArthur's leadership, they did adopt the plans and buy for the B-17, which will become the main horse of World War II. And really, they don't start building a lot of stuff until about 38, 39, when all the trouble's going on in Europe, and they start just putting money to it. Now, MacArthur, as chief of staff, will leave in 1935, and he'll go to the Philippines and take over as building a Philippine army force there, armed forces that can defend the islands. And the thing is in 37, he retires from the Army. So how much he's in the loop about what's going on with air power, innovation, anything like that isn't really taking place. Now, come 1941, after the Japanese move into Indochina and they throw the embargo on them and cut off the oil, Roosevelt recalls MacArthur to the colors, and they make him commander of U.S. Army Forces Far East. Now, MacArthur has a small composite force of Air Corps there, and that's run by this guy on the left, this Henry Claggett. Now, behind him is Harold George. He's the pursuit guy. Now, remember his name. Next to him is this guy, George Gruner. Now, Gruner's the guy who really pushes Washington to federalize the Philippine forces, send them more troops, send them more airplanes, send them more everything. And the War Department back home is like, yeah, we're going to do all that, but MacArthur is going to be in control. And so when MacArthur is chosen, he looks to Claggett, and MacArthur had an estimate, and Claggett's estimate of the air power they need is twice of what MacArthur's is. And MacArthur's like, sure, let's go for it, give it to him. The War Department was planning on sending out a ton of B-17s anyway, about 200 of them. They wanted to pump in about 200 B-17s by April of 1942 and use that as an interdiction to keep the Japanese going from all that oil in the Dutch East Indies. Thing is War Department doesn't think Claggett is up to speed, and they offer MacArthur a new air chief to run a bigger air force out there, and they offer him Louis Brereton, and MacArthur picks Brereton. Brereton is veteran World War I. He had been, big with Billy Mitchell throughout the 20s. And then he comes out there to run this Far East Air Force. Now he comes out there, but the thing is all these B-17s are coming, and from all of November through early December, he's throughout Australia and New Guinea creating routes to bring the B-17s into the Philippines. And by the time he gets there in December of 1941 to finally get everywhere, you've got all these new P-40s. You've got nobody who's flown in them. They're just getting into tactics to work against the Japanese in like the last couple of weeks before the war. And the Japanese are very experienced at what they're doing. And on the morning of December 8th, they come in, and half the bomber force, 17 B-17s, as most of y'all know, is up there at Clark Field. Most of the P-40s have gone up early that morning. The Japanese duped them and then went into Baguio. Brereton had tried to see MacArthur, was shunned off by Sutherland. Finally, at 10 o'clock, they get together and they work this thing out, but everybody's moving in slow motion. It's the difference between a wartime and a peacetime stance. Like I said, the Japanese were experts at what's going on. Everybody's moving in slow motion, and that morning, the Japanese plaster Clark Field. They come in with, over 100 bombers, and then Saburo Sakai comes in with the Japanese Zeros and strafes the place. They shoot down most of the P-40s. They wipe out the bomber force. 2 days later, they hammer Cavite Naval Base, and you've lost your air contingent and your naval contingent overnight. Everybody makes mistakes. There's a lot of tactical errors, but it comes down to MacArthur should have either ordered the bomber run to Formosa, or he should have moved them all down to Mindanao where they were out of range, and they waited too long. Now they got to move out to Corregidor after the Japanese invade to the Bataan Peninsula, and Japanese air power will just hammer them. They have nothing to throw up against them, and it won't be long before April, May that both Bataan and fall. Of course, MacArthur was called out by Roosevelt and left by PT boat and B-17s, got down to Australia. And here you can see the Japanese are moving, and they are already bombing Darwin. They bombed the north coast of Australia right after MacArthur landed February 17th of 42. And MacArthur gets here, and you can see the distance. You can fit the United States right in the middle of everything. And the only way you're going to move around is by naval ship and by air power. I mean, it's not Europe. There is no road to Tokyo. And MacArthur's main concern is, what do I have here for air power? And immediately finds out very little. And he's got this air commander, George Brett, who he's already mad at because when he asked to get ferried out of the Philippines, Brett sent him these old B-17s. He really didn't have anything else, not until the Navy gave him 3 new ones to send up there. Now, MacArthur comes down there, and he's got an air officer. Harold George is with him. He brought that pursuit guy out with him. But the thing is, he's also got Sutherland with him, and Sutherland was the guy who was that main block between Brereton and MacArthur back in the Philippines, and he's going to be the same with George Brett come into Australia. And even Hap Arnold, he's going to say that it should have been Brett who got along with MacArthur because he was the junior officer. But when George Kenney came in, he said it was Sutherland, who was blocking him out. And the thing is after they got there, Harold, this was George on Bataan, before he got pulled out in the PT boats with MacArthur. He got decapitated up at Darwin when a B-17 crashed just a few weeks after landing in Australia. So MacArthur has no air officer on his staff. He's just issuing directives from his desk. He never meets with his naval commanders. They never meet with their air commanders. And you've got Dick Sutherland as chief of staff, who has his pilot's license, so thinks he knows everything about air power. There's Sutherland and MacArthur and his alter ego at that early point stage of the war. It'll change later on. Now, the thing is as well, George Brett couldn't get planes in the air. This is Battle of Coral Sea. That's the Lexington getting hammered by the Japanese, the Japanese painting that we have down at the MacArthur Memorial. And the thing is that Brett's guys were bombing their own ships, bombing American ships during Coral Sea. They couldn't get planes in the air, only a third of them up. The supply system was a mess. He had integrated all the Australian, New Zealand, American crews and everybody else when they told them, to have an allied command, which just caused confusion. And as well, he and MacArthur are at each other's throat. Finally, come July of 1942, Hap Arnold knows he's got to change it up, and that's when MacArthur says, "Oh, I want Frank Andrews." And the thing is, Frank Andrews had been MacArthur's nemesis during that 1930s Chief of Staff period, and he doesn't want to go, so they offer him Jimmy Doolittle or George Kenney, and MacArthur takes George Kenney to come out. Kenney as well had flown a lot of missions in World War I. He runs 4th Air Force at the time. He'll come out there, and MacArthur's going to give him 5th Air Force. Now, the first day he shows up, MacArthur gives, in late July, MacArthur gives an hour-and-a-half diatribe of how the Air Force is the worst thing that's ever been invented, by God, aside from the Navy. And then George Kenney's like, "Look, I'll be loyal. I'm going to make this thing work." And MacArthur's like, "You have my full backing. If you have any problems, that you can't fix, that's when you come to me." And that's MacArthur giving him, full initiative to do basically what he needs to do. And that's the way MacArthur's going to run it the whole time. Now, Kenney shows up right at the end of July. That's right when they're about to kick off that task 1, 2, 3 that the Joint Chiefs had given them as their directives. That's going into Guadalcanal, going up into Papua New Guinea, heading for that main base at Rabaul. Kenney comes in, cleans house. He gets rid of about 5 general officers, gets rid of 40 colonels, majors, lieutenant colonels, and gets his guy, and it's Whitehead who's there. Now, Whitehead's going to be the genius of 5th Air Force. I mean, he'll run advanced command. He's basically Kenney up front, because you saw that distance map. Kenney can't be everywhere, can't run everything by the communications they have at that time. He and Whitehead are in sync. They'll form task forces up in New Guinea, and Whitehead will run the show up there as well. He's got Kenneth Walker, the guy on the left, Brigadier General, running Bomber Command, and that guy on the right, Paul Wirtsmith, he'll run the Fighter Command. These guys are loyal to him. It's the same as with MacArthur. You do your job. You got any problems, you come to me. I'll fix it, but take care of it. Both Walker and Wirtsmith will be killed in plane crashes. Walker during the war and Wirtsmith after the war. Kenney goes and gets the whole supply system reorganized. Finds out that all the supplies are 1,000 miles south in Melbourne. He immediately has them brought all to Brisbane. Clears out the officers that won't get it moving, and he gets everything running in pretty smooth order. Gets the planes back up in the air. Here's a B-17 right after a run over Rabaul. Whereas Brett had about 30%, Kenney's got about 80% running almost immediately, and he is running contact with the Japanese. The thing is, most important about Kenney, he is the shot in the arm for MacArthur. MacArthur had been in this funk since he arrived in Australia, bitter against everything because of what happened in the Philippines. He didn't really have someone that he saw as like a comrade, and I always think, and a lot of other people do too, that Kenney got back that MacArthur of 1918, that World War I. He starts, hey, come on, let's go fly up and see these guys. Gets MacArthur in planes, gets him moving around, gets him integrated with everyone. And I believe it was the greatest thing that could have happened for Douglas MacArthur. As well, Kenney gives him a good strategy: advance the bomber line. Let's get it so that we can use our airfields to cover limited amphibious moves. We won't need aircraft carriers. We'll cover them. We'll move in, and we'll be able to take new ground, build new airfields, and advance the bomber line all the way up through New Guinea. Even though they're stuck down at Buna, down here on the south east corner of New Guinea at this time, they're already thinking of where they're going. They know supplies will come eventually, and they'll be able to get this thing moving. Kenney's main belief is you have to control the air first. He says you have to go after the source. And so his whole thing is plastering Japanese airfields. This is against a lot of Navy doctrine where they want umbrellas over the fleet, which Kenney will have to work with. This is against a lot of what the other officers, the air officers, believe. And Kenney is going to be full force on this, is that you have to have control of air before you can do everything. And the best way to protect everyone is to just keep clobbering the Japanese. This is them hitting Rabaul. Rabaul is Simpson Harbor, the deepest harbor in the Pacific at that time. I think it got filled in by a volcano a couple of years ago. It had 5 airfields, 100,000 troops. It's the main Japanese base for that region. It's target number 1. The thing is that Kenney's bases are all down here at Port Moresby. There's 5 really good airfields, got a good base to them. The thing is, the Owen Stanleys are the mountain range. They're 15,000 feet high. You know, you can't get over them without losing all your gas. And he has to get a better way to be able to run on Rabaul. Here you can see with Japanese moves. They move into Guadalcanal, and the Marines will go in there in early August. Then the Japanese will move down here, attack Milne Bay, where Kenney's building that airfield. The Australians under Clouds will give them their first defeat and push them back into the sea, and they'll get those air bases done. And then Kenney has a straight line without having to cross those mountains anymore, straight at Rabaul. And they'll start be able to put these task forces together where they'll hit them, and that's how he's going to help the Navy out at Guadalcanal, as well as by taking care of all these Japanese at Rabaul, the airplanes there. Now, he wants the A-20s. He wants the B-24s. He's got very scant of the bombers at this time. He's only got the P-39s and the P-40s. You know, they're totally outclassed by the Japanese Zero. He needs those P-38s, P-47s. Hap Arnold, who's the air commander back in Washington, understands this, but Hap Arnold is working on a global atmosphere, and Kenney will always have 75% less than what they have in Europe. But he's always, you know, chomping as well as MacArthur. You know, we're going to need more air if we're going to be able to put this thing through. And as well, I put that doctrine with the question mark because it's like, doctrine, what doctrine? You know, the Air Force, Army Air Corps at that time is all about high altitude bombing. That's you know what they're going to use in Europe. But Kenney says it's different in the Pacific. You fly a treetop, you pack the bombers full of guns up front, and you hit them low, because the Japanese don't have the anti-aircraft systems that the Germans have at this time. So he kind of flips it on its end. Thing is Kenneth Walker, who's the bomber guy, is a high altitude guy. I mean, Kenney invents skip bombing, and Walker doesn't understand it at all. Why are we doing this? And he's a high altitude guy. In November of 1942, he climbs in a B-17 to San Antonio Roads and goes on a mission to Rabaul, you know, totally violating Kenney's orders, and gets shot down. They've never found him. His son's looking for him now, looking for the plane still. And Kenney's like, you know, if he comes back, I'm going to court-martial him. And MacArthur says, well, if he doesn't, you know, I'm going to give him the Medal of Honor. They put Freddie Smith in to take Walker's place. He you know, he dies a hero. Still not really understood why he went on that trip. But, you know, and then they pulled out this high altitude, you know, level run that they weren't really using at that time. Kenney's whole thing is innovation. This is Pappy Gunn here. He's a mad scientist of airplanes. He puts all those 50 calibers in the nose of the B-25 Mitchell. He actually took a 40 millimeter cannon up there and had it sticking out the front of, you know, the cockpit, and they shot it off, and it filled the whole thing with smoke, and he couldn't fly the plane. You know, he's trying to get through. This guy was a madman. But that's what they're all about. They're about building extra tanks for when they get the P-38s, so that they can fly missions with the B-17s. It's all of the new kind of warfare. Like I said, they invent they get the parachute bombs that Kenney had invented in the 30s. They start using all these different tactics, and it's basically this pirate show. They go, and there you go. There's, you know, the B-25s flying in there right at treetop level, and that's the way they'll work throughout that Pacific campaign, the Army Air Corps. And then the biggest innovation that comes is September 1942, when they're in that Papua New Guinea struggle, because the Japanese have ensconced themselves on the north coast, and they're not going to give up till they're all dead. It's one of the most brutal campaigns. It's a World War I all over again. They have more casualties there than they do at Guadalcanal. But Kenney's the first one that flies like a whole regiment up, and he flies the 128th Regiment up there to New Guinea, up right at Port Moresby. Everybody on the staff was against it. MacArthur was the only one for it. MacArthur's looking for anything to make a move, and Kenney said, as long as I got this guy on my back, I'm going to be able to do anything I want to. Come to the end of the campaign, early January 43, he's got those north coasts. He doesn't have to worry about the Owen Stanleys anymore. They're getting ready to march on the next moves. Cartwheel heading towards Rabaul. He's getting more planes, and he's sitting in Kenney's sitting in a pretty good position. He's got the air warning systems working pretty good against the Japanese, and it's really going to kick off now, because in March of 1943, that's when Ultra Signals Intelligence just starts really doing its show. They break the water transport code in March of 1943. That unleashes when they know the next big convoy's coming. The Kenney's airmen had seen them in Rabaul Harbor, but the Japanese are about to put 3,000 troops into New Guinea, which would have totally messed up that Cartwheel operation, but the Air Force is able to jump on them. They sink 8 transports, and 3,000 Japanese are killed. It totally changes the land war at that time in New Guinea. Again, Ultra in August of 1943 cues that Kenney's got all these Japanese fighters coming in, figures it out August 17th, basically the day that a couple of hundred fighters land at Wewak, Hansa Bay. They're able to cream them because they had built this overnight airport in the jungle in a place called Silly Silly. Now they changed it to Mangandan because if it failed, they didn't want them to know that the airplane was called Silly Silly. But they wiped out Japanese air power at that time. I mean, and basically got control of the air immediately. And that was right before the Australians went into Lae and Salamaua as part of these Cartwheel plans. And right at the same time that the Americans are landing down there at Nassau Bay. MacArthur's going to use parachute operations as well. This is MacArthur with J.J. Tolson, 503rd Parachute Infantry. They'll jump over Nadzab in September of 1943. Nadzab was a spot where they'd meet up with the 7th Australian Division. They'll be used as a decoy to keep the Japanese focused on them from Salamaua and Lae, while Blamey lands all his other 7th Division there. It's one of the textbook campaigns of World War II. But MacArthur went on this parachute drop, and he liked it so much, and he's going to use it for the rest of the time in the Pacific. They had the disastrous landing at Nome Ford there on the left in July of 1944. They dropped it from too low, but over Corregidor, it was the greatest tactical surprise ever. And Los Banos rescue of all the 2,400 prisoners of war by the 511th Airborne, textbook operations for the airborne. Now, how the system works is MacArthur gives all operational control to this guy, Walter Kruger, the guy on the right with the pipe in his mouth. He gets together with Kenney in the Air Force, Barbie, that's him on the left. He's the amphibious guy, and he works all the plans out for each invasion. Same on the right. That's Kenney with Field Marshal Blamey. He controls all the operational planning for the Australian missions. Now, MacArthur is the arbiter. They usually can get together and work things out, but if they have problems, and Kenney and Barbie will have a lot of problems because Kenney's about the most anti-Navy person there is. And Kenney believes in this doctrine of hitting the air bases, whereas Barbie's like, I need air cover, an umbrella over me all the time, like I would have if I had aircraft carriers here. And so when they have these problems at Lae Salamaua, Cape Gloucester, and all these different issues, MacArthur will come in. He makes a choice. He usually sides with the Navy and tells Kenney to put the air props over them, and same with the Australians. So it's basically that system. It's different than anywhere else, and everybody there is on board with MacArthur. They don't have any problems with him. Kenney doesn't like MacArthur personally, but says he's the best commander I ever worked with. You know, if you want to have a boss, that's the guy to have, because he left you alone to do your job. And MacArthur's like, you're the expert. You get me to Leyte. You get me back to the Philippines. As well as Kruger, that's the way he always looks. He doesn't care. Just get me there, and you know, I'm going to show you the way. Just let me do my job. Thing is, December 1943, all the way on the right, that's Chief of Staff George C. Marshall. It's his only visit to the Southwest Pacific area. And he met with MacArthur and all the commanders, and he told MacArthur that with the big Joint Chiefs, combined chiefs of the British staff meeting they just had, they didn't think he was going to be going back to the Philippines, you know, Mindanao at the most. And this gets MacArthur's mind thinking. Now, the next month at Sidor, that's right where this arrow begins here, the 32nd Regimental Combat Team landed there, and they pushed in, and that forced the Japanese 20th Division to move out of Sayo. Now, a bunch of Australian minesweepers went in there, thought they found this mine, but they found this trunk. It had every Japanese code book of the 20th Division. Overnight, the Central Bureau goes from reading a couple of messages a day to reading thousands, and soon they know exactly where all the Japanese are at this time. Now, the end of Cartwheel was supposed to go up and hit at Madang here and maybe Wewak and Hansa Bay. but they know there are 40,000 Japanese troops at Wewak. So one of his G3 officers pitches MacArthur on going 580 miles to Hollandia. The thing is, he needs to take those Admiralty Islands. They're not due to go there till about April 1st. Now you're getting into the middle of February, and George Kenney starts saying that his pilots are not seeing any cook fires, not seeing anybody in the Admiralty Islands, that they should move in there right now, advance the timetable, and move on Hollandia as fast as they can. And MacArthur's like, well, that would get us back in the game. That would put the cork in the bottle over Rabaul. You know, this is something that we can do. But thing is Ultra knows, you know, code breaking, signals intelligence knows there's over 4,000 Japanese in the Admiralties. So this is a gamble by MacArthur to keep himself in the game and to seize this place, advance the timetable, and really keep up with Nimitz, who is now pushed into the Marshall Islands. Now Barbie, who's there on the left, and Kruger, they're against this. But Kenney's all for it. Let's move into there. These guys do not know about ultra and signals intelligence, what it's telling MacArthur. But MacArthur says to Kenney, all right, if the new Navy guy, Kincaid, and that's him right there, goes for it, I'm all for it. And that's Kincaid and MacArthur actually flying to get on the ship that's going to take them to the Admiralties. They go in 2 months early. 1,000 men reconnaissance force of the 1st Cavalry Division. They were supposed to take the whole division in there. MacArthur lands with them. Tells Chase, the guy on the left there in the combat photo, you know, you got your teeth in them, hold on, we'll hold this position. And basically the JCS at that point was right in discussion of what strategy was going to be. And MacArthur's chief of staff, when he was there, was like, we just took the Admiralties. And they're all like, what? And it was like, okay, keep going. And that's what put him there. And Kenney believed that he had talked MacArthur into doing this. And the general was like, yeah, okay, you just keep believing that. Now that they've got the Admiralties, they get the JCS to let them push on to Hollandia. But now it's going to be Army-Navy show, because Nimitz is going to come in with his people, and they're going to have aircraft carriers covering this invasion. And this is the way it will work in the Pacific. The Navy will have coverage of the invasion area, and the Army will have coverage and limit the Army air supply that comes from the areas in the periphery. And so Nimitz gets together with MacArthur, works out how they're going to move in these aircraft carriers off Hollandia, and Kenney over here promises to wipe out everything the Japanese can possibly throw up against them. So through March and early April, he's just crushing all of Wewak, Hansa Bay, making it look like they're going into Wewak, Hansa Bay, using a lot of deception as well. Hitting everything that's in Hansa Bay. This is Air Force attacks on these trawlers that they use to resupply. This is them hitting them with the parachute frags at Dagwa Air Base, just wiping out everything the Japanese have. Now, they'll keep moving things in later, but for right now, they're able to gain that control of the air just by taking them out. April 22nd, they move into Hollandia, but it's not what they thought. The airfields are no good. They are soft. They can't get any heavy bombers in there. So immediately the air needs to move on. They start looking, and that's what it becomes from now on, is this push from Hollandia to the western Vogelkop. And they'll be using ultra intelligence the whole way to land where the Japanese aren't, but they're trying to seize airfields that can hold the weight. They go into Biak, it doesn't work because it's all soft ground. Not till they can get to Owie, where that's coral, like Wakti Island was back here, but they're small and they're subject to Japanese attack. And they'll reach the Vogelkop Peninsula by July of 1944. And then you're looking at going into the Philippines with the Spence of MacArthur's pitch to get him back there. But they were working either Navy drive before Mosa or back to the Philippines. They know they can get to the Philippines with what they have in store. But the problem is Army, Air Force, Army cannot hit Leyte from anywhere their bases are. And this is going to be an entirely a naval show. Kenney's doesn't think the Japanese have any air power left. He thinks they're totally destroyed. He's totally wrong. His air chief, Ennis Whitehead, is like, nope, we should go into Mindanao first. So we have air bases there that we can then throw an umbrella over Leyte as well. Kenney will wade ashore with MacArthur. Leyte Gulf will be a total Navy show. No Army Air Corps is involved whatsoever because they have no way to reach that area. And they were expecting they could roll right into Leyte. At least Kenney was. All the engineers were telling them, you got nothing but slop there. And they roll in to Leyte, and sure enough, you can't get anything going. No steel matting will work, nothing whatsoever. You can't get any land-based air. MacArthur is embarrassed because he has to keep asking Halsey to keep the Mitchers carriers there to cover the area. And then the Japanese start pumping in troops. You've got no land-based air to be able to take them out. And the Japanese put 37,000 troops into Leyte. You know, they'll have 400 that surrender in the campaign. They even get to the point where they have to bring in Marine Corps air because they can't get the night fighters to be able to fight off the Japanese as well. The Japanese are using the kamikaze tactics now, and it is just a really bad show there on Leyte. MacArthur wants to move on to Mindoro real quick, and Kenney's telling him, we can't. We don't have the cover to do any of this. And MacArthur's just going crazy. We got to keep this timetable up. And Kenney was like, well, do you want me to tell you the truth, or, you know, do you want me to just be a yes man to you? And MacArthur was like, well, of course I want you to tell the truth. I just want you to, you know, just understand that I'm going to go crazy, you know, but I understand where you're coming from. Finally, December 15th, they're able to roll into Mindoro. That's it on the left side. And the soil there is perfect. Now they've got their base. They can hit everything from Luzon down through the Visayas to the south. They'll put in all their air power there. And the thing is, the Japanese will waste everything they have on kamikazes as they move into Luzon. So when the Americans land there in early January of 45, basically the Japanese don't have anything. Now, this is over Manila. Their C-47s are flying DDT. They didn't bomb the city. This is all from artillery as well. They get into close air support. That's what they start learning there. They'll forget the lesson again. Kenney's focused on Japan, June, July. He's a full general. MacArthur had put him up to be promoted, and he's looking on bombing Kyushu. That's when you get to the end of the war, looking towards the invasion of Japan. And Hap Arnold, McKinney had always wanted the B-29, but the Hap Arnold would never give it to him. It was always going to be for the Marianas. The Air Force was looking to, you know, state their case for why they needed to be an independent arm. And Kenney would always, you know, be fighting for his theater and would criticize Arnold in Washington for not fulfilling this. But in March of 45, he realized what was up, and that's why he'll give Spaatz his full support, even though MacArthur doesn't believe that they should have this independent Air Force coming out there with the Strategic Air Command. But that's what, you know, strategic bombing and then the atomic bombs and the Russian, you know, drive-in is what's going to be the end of the war. Kenney won't even really have to exert that much force on the Kyushu. War's end, MacArthur says that Kenney was the greatest air commander of World War II. Heaps bestows praise on him, and learns all his lessons of how air power needs to work from Kenney, which, like I said at the beginning, I think is part of what the danger is going into Korea, because he's got a lot of faith in it. They move into the jet age during that occupation of Japan phase. About April of 49, they bring out George Stratemeyer. He had been in China, Burma, India. He's a doctrine guy. He believes in high altitude bombing. He believes that strategic bombing can take care of everything. And when the Korean War starts and the North Koreans push across the 38th parallel, the 5th Air Force, Far East Air Force, it's the strongest arm MacArthur has. And Stratemeyer's boys start going to work. They take out everything, rail yards, bridges, roads, doing everything they can to hamper the North Koreans as they push the American forces under Walton Walker down to the Pusan perimeter here. Now, I put this in here because in August of 50, MacArthur made that VFW speech, and basically he put it in here because it has a lot to do with today. MacArthur said Taiwan was the unsinkable aircraft carrier. It could never be let go, or else you would put the total Pacific at peril. He had to withdraw it. The president ordered him to, but they didn't fire him for it, you know, even though he went against policy about speaking about China, because they were getting ready for the Incheon invasion, and MacArthur was really the only guy pushing for this thing. He's getting ready to, he believes he can relieve everything in Pusan by moving in behind the North Koreans at Incheon. It's a total success. MacArthur goes from his experience, and he knows that Naval Air, Marine Corps Air is what you use for the invasion. Stratemeyer's guys are going to have to do on the periphery, and it's going to be Naval Air that controls everything as the Marines go in there at Incheon. Complete success. They get right to the parallel, and the UN and Truman say, yep, let's push up, let's unite the country, let's hold free elections. And they push up right to the Chongchon River, right up here on your top left. And that's where 8th Army under Walton Walker will be after the Chinese had warned them, if you come across the 38th parallel, we'll come in. Peng Dehuai, under cover of night, had moved in 180,000 troops. They spring the trap late October. All those messages between MacArthur and the JCS are all at MacArthur Memorial. You can come down and read them. And MacArthur was basically saying, I need to bomb the Yalu bridges. Men and material are moving over the bridges. Basically, they were already there. Song Shi Lun had already moved in another 200,000 troops. JCS says, no way. MacArthur said, my command faces destruction. But as Conrad Crane, who's the big expert on air power, said, Stratemeyer told him, don't worry about it. I'm going to take him out. MacArthur had that belief like he did with Kenney, but they couldn't do it. And no matter how much they bombed every hut in North Korea, the Chinese had no big equipment, no trucks, no tanks, no heavy artillery, and they moved right in and you could not see them. Here's MacArthur on an inspection with George Stratemeyer from his C-121. November, MacArthur was going to move to the Yalu, and the Chinese sprung the trap. 350,000 came against the 8th Army as well as the Marine Corps up at Chosin. They retreated out. All the Chinese had to do was get behind them and hold those mountain passes. Exactly what happened. And that's when the Marine Corps Air really came in with that close air support again, which the Army was going to have to learn all over again. MacArthur believed you needed to bomb Manchuria. Conventionally, he never asked for nukes, and he wanted to put a blockade on China. The JCS wouldn't let him do it. He kept putting together all these plans for winning the war, whereas the UN command and the president especially wanted to get out. They didn't want World War III. They didn't want Soviets moving into Western Europe. Like Bradley said, wrong war, wrong place, wrong time. And MacArthur was adamant that if you don't take care of this now, you're still going to have this problem a couple of generations, and the Soviets and the Chinese might be strong enough to actually do something with us. MacArthur was relieved to command April 1951. That's pretty much him and air power throughout his career. Like I said, he really put most trust into his air commanders. He gave them the job to do it. I don't think he understood much about the effects of, you think about it, World War I, it took him a year for the U.S. forces to get into the campaigns, whereas in World War II, in a matter of hours, his air force had been obliterated. He learned the lesson immediately from that moment on, and that's pretty much it. If you all have questions.
Jim, thank you so much for just the energy and passion that you bring to the story of Douglas MacArthur and his wartime experiences. I do want to let everyone know that the MacArthur Memorial is currently open Tuesday through Saturday, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. So if you're looking for a great thing to do and you're over in the Norfolk area, definitely check out the memorial. Jim, if you're ready for questions, we've got quite a few that have come in.
Yeah, sure. Let them go.
All right, we've got a couple of folks who've asked the question about the retaking of the Philippines versus, from a strategic perspective versus the more direct Central Pacific campaign favored by the Navy. Was this a strategic move, or was it about MacArthur's desire to remove a perceived blemish from his military service record?
Well, there's a lot of people that say that. The factor comes down to shipping, though. When they had that conference in Pearl Harbor in July of 1944, they go in there, and of course, Nimitz is there to do King's plan to go to Formosa, and MacArthur's to go back to the Philippines. And MacArthur says right there, we don't have shipping, to get to Formosa. You're probably going to have to stop the war in Europe to be able to do this. And the JCS was looking to do what they could do with what they had in theater. And you had the shipping and you had the personnel to be able to do an invasion of the Philippines at that time. They weren't looking at all the Philippines. They were thinking maybe going into one place, Mindanao, and then doing that as a jump. Nimitz definitely didn't want to go into Luzon. It all comes down to, how things progressed in the war. The 20th the Air Force, the Strategic Air Force in China got pushed back because of Japanese offensives, that 14th Air Force, and they couldn't be a factor in the war anymore. And as well as MacArthur said to Roosevelt, if they didn't go back to the Philippines, over 1 million Filipinos were going to starve. And that was the truth. The breadbasket of the Philippines was Thailand, and it was cut off. And all rice stocks in the Philippines had been turned to cotton by the Japanese, which was a total failure. I mean, they were already dying at a rate of hundreds a day by late 1944 at that point. And so when MacArthur made that point to Roosevelt. It was no fabrication. And can you imagine what would have happened if we had let over 1 million Filipinos starve? I mean, talk about going back and destroying Manila. That would be even worse.
I think that's a well-made point that there was a humanitarian crisis unfolding in the Philippines. We've got a couple questions coming in relative to MacArthur's experience in Korea. In your assessment, is it fair to say that MacArthur was focused on China and that Truman was focused on the Soviet Union, and that kind of led to the conflict between the two? Could you maybe expand upon that a little bit?
Well, I think Truman's looking at the world. The JCS is looking at the world. They're very worried about a Soviet push into Western Europe. They just got NATO up, and then this thing comes in Korea, which the State Department had pretty much put outside its littoral defense. Even MacArthur had, because he had no control in it beforehand. Yeah, of course they're worried about the Soviets. They're worried about the Chinese. But here's the thing: MacArthur, as everybody knows, he was kind of a loose cannon in World War II. And so when you get to the 38th parallel, it's not MacArthur that crosses the parallel. It's Truman and the UN that orders them to unite the country. So you're going to send Douglas MacArthur to the Yalu River when you don't want to get into a war with the Soviet Union and China. It just seems kind of goofy to me. So yeah, I mean they're worried about the world especially, but it just seems they have a stated goal. MacArthur fulfills it after everybody was looking at what was going to be at Dunkirk. Then immediately they change it, go to the Yalu River. I mean, even before right before the Chinese came in, they were still saying unite the country and hold free elections. Then it changes again, go back to the 38th parallel, and then it becomes hold on and kill as many Chinese as you can until we can get them to come to the peace table. And so yeah, different perspectives, different ideas, and they didn't know each other. They only met that one time, and you've got all of MacArthur's staff basically like, oh, that Truman's out to get you, and all of Truman's staff is, oh, that MacArthur doesn't even, he doesn't listen to anybody. And so it's basically this crisis in communication.
On the subject of kind of cluttered communications, um, if MacArthur hadn't asked for nuclear weapons, where does that rumor emerge from? That's kind of a persistent thing that you hear, often cited in connection with his being relieved of command. Was there truth to it? Was it a discussion point? Where does that story come from?
Well, it comes from what happens after the war, basically from a newspaper interviews that are done on his birthday in 1954. During the war, no, Conrad Crane, he's the guy who runs wrote the book on air power Korea. He's the expert on it. He worked up the Institute of Military History. It's American Heritage Educational Command, I think now up at Carlisle. And he scoured it. Roger Dingman has scoured it. Everybody has, looking for where MacArthur to ask to use nukes. Now, there was an early conference when I think Vandenberg comes out in like June of 1950, and they're talking about if the Chinese come in and about all these mountain passes. And MacArthur makes this comment, well, that's perfect place for atomic bomb, sweeten up my B-29 force. But he doesn't ask for more B-29s. He doesn't ask for atomic bombs or anything like that. But then when the Chinese come in 1950, in December, the Atomic Energy Commission, Charles Bolt, sends MacArthur a message, says, hey, if the Soviets come into this thing, do we have sites we're going to bomb? And MacArthur sends back this list. Yes, these would be the sites that would be bombed. And what it is, it's a replication of those old 1940s plans, stretch table, undershot, long shot, something like that, where they had all these cities picked of, if the Soviets and the United States went to nuclear war. And so a lot of authors use that message of MacArthur's reply, and they're like, yeah, look, he's asking for to use nuclear weapons, but they never look at the first message where Bolt is like, what are the cities we're going to use? Come March of 1951, the things that have just been declassified, the U.S. Air Force thought that the Soviets had moved 4 air divisions on the border. They thought this thing was about to kick off. They got the nuke pits ready out in the Pacific. And MacArthur knows this, and he's like, hey, do I have D-Day capability, to be able to, use the bomb if they use it against me immediately? This was about a month before he got relieved of command. And so there are those messages, but never during the war does he say, I want to use, atomic bombs now. Even after the Chinese come in, he says, I want to bomb these places in China conventionally. I want to use a blockade of China. I want to bring in Chiang Kai-shek's troops, but he never asked to use nukes. In January, Ridgway's asking him to use chemical weapons, because they're pulling down to Pusan again, and they're thinking it's going to be another Dunkirk. And MacArthur's like, we don't have the authorization to use that. That's something that's, letting the genie out of the box. So MacArthur's not this madman, that everybody's made him out to be. The thing is when MacArthur is relieved of command, he comes back and he says, I've got this plan to end the war. And Eisenhower is about to be the president. He says, well, what's the plan? And Bradley gets a hold of MacArthur, says, we want you to come to the White House. And MacArthur says this, he says, Eisenhower, you're the only one the Soviets trust, or the only one the Soviets fear. And he says, you go over there and you tell them we'll pull out of West Germany. If they pull out of East Germany, we'll get out of Korea. If they get out of Korea, stop this war. Let's draw down on the nukes. And if they don't want to do it, we'll show them that we can end the war in Korea tomorrow. You know what I mean? At first, Eisenhower was for it, and John Foster Dulles was there. Now we can't do that. And so that was tossed. But in 1954, MacArthur gave these interviews with Jim Lucas and Bob Considine on his birthday. And he said that they were like, could you have won the war? And he was like, easily. All I had to do was drop 30 to 50 atomic bombs, under cover of night, wipe out the Air Force, drive in Chiang's troop, so use these two amphibious marine elements, and I could have won the war in about a week and a half. And both of them held on to the stories until after MacArthur was dead. And that's when they printed them. Now, the thing was, is in 1960, Truman had given a TV interview where he said MacArthur wanted to use atomic weapons, and MacArthur was like, hey, produce the document that says I ever wanted to do that. And Truman came back the next day. He said, well, that's what I thought he wanted to do. I don't really, he didn't really ask to use them. But in 64, right after his death, these two articles from Considine and Lucas come out. And MacArthur's aide, Whitney, that guy in the middle of the picture, he was like, he never gave that speech. Whereas MacArthur's intelligence chief, Willoughby, was like, oh, yeah, he totally said that. And so that's where it comes from, is that MacArthur, said I could easily stop this war or ended the war, overnight by doing, dropping 30 to 50 bombs. He never proposes that, or at least it has not been found yet within any files at the War Department, National Archives, Presidential Archives, anything like that. And so that's where we stand, where we stand today.
I think that's a great clarification to offer, and it's interesting how these things kind of take on a life of their own, and sometimes that sensationalized story becomes larger than the true story behind it. We've got a couple folks who've asked the question for clarification on some of the confusion in the early days of the war. You had mentioned that American aircraft had attacked our own ships, and it's my assumption that you're referring to the 7th of May attack by B-17s onto a large number of U.S. and Australian ships.
Exactly, yeah.
Amidst the confusion. Can you maybe talk about the situation that MacArthur was in at that time with all of the chaos that was running rampant at that time?
Well, the as you saw from the map, that we put on there, the Japanese were coming. I mean, they had already moved into Leh and Salamao before MacArthur gets there. They're coming into Guadalcanal already, and it's they were looking at having a strategic defensive the whole time and just concentrating on Europe. And it's like Kenney said when he got there. He said the Japanese don't understand that we're in a strategic defensive. They're still attacking. We got to move this thing now as well. Like I said, MacArthur was in this state where he totally doesn't trust the Navy. The Navy back in Washington, they don't trust him. Hart, who had been the commander in the Philippines, had gone back to Washington and told Ernest King that MacArthur was crazy. Basically, and so that's what everybody believes. Even Stimson, who's the Secretary of War, would be like, this childish hatred that the Navy has of MacArthur is just ridiculous. But MacArthur would feed it right back. They all had this inter-service rivalry, and they're just getting their feet on the ground. It's funny because in MacArthur's reminiscences, one of the first things he says is there was no inter-service rivalry between the Navy and the Army. And in June of '42, he had told George C. Marshall, back in the 30s, I discovered a plot where the Navy was trying to take over the Army. So they've got all these things going around. MacArthur doesn't trust his air chief. The air chief doesn't trust MacArthur. The only thing that MacArthur has going is he's got the trust of the Australian Prime Minister, and he's got the trust of Churchill and Roosevelt. And as long as he's got that, he's going to be able to work it. Nimitz is a fair guy. Halsey will come to find that MacArthur's the best friend he ever had, and so a lot of these guys will know that MacArthur is what he is, but they don't think he's a goofball. They know that he knows his business. And that's like Barbie said, I don't really like this guy, but he knows what his business is. And it's not until they get really Kenney down there that he's got someone that he can work with that's really capable. Like those early days, the communication was so bad. I think that's more the reason for Brett's people bombing those ships at the Coral Sea battle, that I showed that picture of. It's not until much later on that they get communications really working. As you showed, that picture of distance is that, and that'll run to the end of the war, going on to Leyte Gulf, when you have those big communication problems with Halsey and Kincaid and Nimitz during that Battle of Leyte Gulf. Where's Task Force 34? So it's everybody getting used to it, I think.
I think that that kind of feeds into another question we've got asked, and folks, we're just about to wrap up. So if you do have any other last minute questions, go ahead and input those now. But Jim, you mentioned by the time of the Inchon invasion, MacArthur has trust in the Navy and an understanding of how to leverage naval air power. Can you elaborate a little further on the move from the sort of unusual distrust early in the Second World War to this kind of place of close collaboration later in the war, and ultimately is the sort of intrinsic trust of betting the ranch on the Navy's ability to do what they need to do in the landings at Inchon?
Yeah, it's like he said at that Inchon meeting. It seems, I have more trust in the Navy than they have the trust in themselves. He knew how to work people, definitely. I mean, at the end of the war, he and Nimitz were totally ticked off with each other about what was coming up with the invasion of Japan. But then, because MacArthur wouldn't go to Guam and meet with Nimitz. But then when Nimitz flies to Manila, the better man, to meet with him, MacArthur is like, no, you're not staying with the Navy guys. You're coming to stay with my house. You and me are going to work this thing out. And that's the way MacArthur was. He was like this in-person guy, same way he is with Halsey. At the end of the war, Spruance goes to see MacArthur, the great hero of Midway, the great hero of the Marianas Islands. And all the Navy guys were like, MacArthur's just going to talk and talk. You're never going to get a word in edgeways. And Spruance said he went in there and MacArthur didn't say a word. He was like gripping the handles the whole time, as Spruance spoke, because he knew he was there with a warrior. Same way MacArthur is with Halsey. MacArthur will say of Nimitz, even they had all these problems, he was the greatest commander that any country has ever produced, greatest naval admiral in the history of warfare. When you get there to Inchon, MacArthur has these troops that are not up to speed. At first, he wanted to do Operation Blue Hearts at Inchon with the 1st Cavalry Division, but after a couple of weeks, he's like, man, I need Marines for this thing. And he goes to Lem Shepard, Fleet Marine. He's like, hey, Lem, can you get me these guys? And Shepard was like, well, I control them, but you got to put in the word. And so he had Shepard sit right down there and type it out. Puts him in, and Shepard's like, I'm not only going to give you 1st Marines, I'm going to give you 1st Marine Air Wing. MacArthur's like, here we go. And he knew that worked from World War II. He had seen it at Leyte, where the Navy took care of, even though of Halsey's runoff, he had total confidence after, in Halsey, even after that, because everybody was ragging on him at the table, and MacArthur slammed on the table, I'm not going to hear any more talk about Bull Halsey, he's a fighting commander, and I'm going to go with him. And so at that meeting, Forrest Sherman, who's the chief of naval operations, and J. Lawton Collins, they flew out to Tokyo because they were worried about this thing that MacArthur wanted to go in because they have those 40-foot tides. They were worried all the ships would be caught there during the day, which they would be. And so they come in to talk them into coming, lower down. And they did the stupidest thing they could have done. They got into a closed room with MacArthur. And they're all sitting there, and everybody's like, I don't know if we can do this. And then MacArthur gets up and he starts talking about Wolfe and Montcalm and Quebec. the French and Indian War, and everybody's like, what's he talking about? And MacArthur's like, all those, it was surprise. It doesn't matter what year it is, what type of weapons you have. Everything comes down to surprise. And that, all those obstacles you just listed are the very reason we're going to go in there. And this naval commander got up afterwards like, well, as an expert on naval gunnery, I don't think we can, do this. And Forrest Sherman's so ginned up, he's like, I've forgotten more about naval gunnery you're ever going to know. Sit down and shut up. And so, MacArthur's got all these guys moving. And like you said, he's got them all believing again. And that's why this thing works. It's not because MacArthur has this unbelievable strategic plan, this mystical ability. It's because all those guys in the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Marine Corps were professionals. They were the best of the best. They were all experienced from World War II. Doyle, who runs the invasion team, Chesty Puller with the Marines, all those guys that move all the way through. And that's the reason this thing comes off because it does, is because the professionalism of the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Marines.
Well, I think that's an important place to leave it, is that MacArthur's trust in the professionalism of others really is the story of his involvement with air power, and really the story of his involvement with much of the rest of the war. Is that a fair statement?
I think so, but it's like I say, I think he thought air power could do everything, because as was proven with with Stratemeyer and obliterating North Korea for that month before they finally went on that final offensive, he couldn't stop the Chinese from coming in. Couldn't stop the Chinese from coming down. It took troops on the ground. He was trying to prove, or that was the way to prove the entire doctrine didn't work. You had to get back to close air support, and that's what they find out when they get into that stage in the barrier war of after MacArthur's gone.
Well, Jim, thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you, everyone, for joining us as well. And we hope you've enjoyed the presentation. I think it's certainly been enlightening to hear more about Douglas MacArthur from folks over there at the MacArthur Memorial, the great repository of his personal documents and all of his effects and the material culture that he accumulated over his life. It's a great place to go and visit if you haven't had an opportunity to. Thank you all for joining us again tonight, and we look forward to seeing you next week as we're rejoined by Bruce Gamble as to talk about the battle surrounding Rabaul. So actually kind of this presentation is kind of a jumping off point into that discussion.
It's a very good book, by the way.
Oh, Bruce is fantastic, and he's been a speaker a couple times. And Jim, maybe you'll join us for the webinar and enjoy hearing from Bruce also.
Sounds good to me.
All right, thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.